As we continue into this module, we get introduced to the endocrine system, and we spoke so much about the energy systems of the body, how we produce ATP and how our bodies take food from the environment and use that for energy and cellular function. And then we've starting to get in that discussion, that conversation about how stress applies to the body and how we use that stress to change the physiology, and all of those adaptations and all the changes in the substrates that's available is driven by the hormonal system, which is part of the endocrine system. And so when we look at the hormones, it's theorized that this can be manipulated naturally with lifestyle factors, nutritional choices, and the intensity and rest periods and volume of exercise that you expose your body to. Hormones drive tissue storage and breakdown, so the anabolic and catabolic states, and it's up to us as exercise specialists to drive those hormonal responses, adaptations towards what our personal or our trainer or client's goals are for fitness. So before we have that conversation, we take a step back and look at the organization of the human body. And we jumped right into the systems, looking at the muscular system and the components of the human movement system. And we've talked about these things like the muscle tissue or the cellular component. But when we study anatomy, you look at it from these 6 tiers, and you can look at it as small as the chemical level. So looking at the molecular makeup or the atomic makeup of the components. Or you can look at the big picture and look at the organism itself, so how it's interacting with its environment and so forth. And there's usually a spectrum that we look at this, but for our conversation, we want to just bring a couple key points out. First, the cellular level or the chemical level, we are introduced to the DNA. And as if you remember, the DNA is the blueprint of the body. And so this is what drives the protein synthesis. So when you want new muscle tissue, or you want new bone tissue or new neural adaptations, this is driven by the motor is the DNA, and it's driven by the hormones or the environmental influences that you are creating to get those particular adaptations. What we're hoping to happen is that the DNA in the cell itself starts to create more proteins, and then those proteins end up being stored in the tissue, particularly muscle tissue. In this case, it's looking at cardiac muscle, but let's say this is skeletal muscle. We want more of those protein filaments that are there that are going to create more cross bridges, more bulk, more mass, more strength, more power, and give us the outcomes that we're looking for. When we look at the cellular structure, we get this basic cell structure for most animal life. And although the cellular components vary with different system and body, like the neuron versus the muscle cell versus the osteoclast, cells have this general structure where they have a cell membrane, they have a mitochondria. Mitochondria, as we talked about last unit, and a little bit we'll talk about into this unit, that's the furnace or the powerhouse of the cell. That's where energy and cellular respiration is happening. And you have a whole bunch of other structures, but just for our conversation here, we want to focus on the nucleus, which is where the blueprints, the DNA is housed, and this is where protein transcription occurs. And so we're looking at how can hormones get from the environment and get into the bloodstream and into the cell. And it first has to pass through the cell membrane, which is this phospholipid membrane, which is fat on the outside, protein on the inside, and it creates a barrier or a separation between the extracellular and the intracellular space. If I back up one slide here, the nucleus also has a cellular membrane, and so you have 2 tiers of defense, if you will, like a gate or fence around those aspects. But as we get into this conversation, we'll look closely at the cellular membrane and see that there's these different proteins that are like receptors and sensitive to different aspects. There's channels that are here that allow glucose or other things to kind of transfer in and out of the cell. And not that we're going to be an expert in this, because this is a whole system of the body, and there's a whole field of medicine looking at endocrinology, and it's very fascinating, and it's still in its infancy. They're still trying to figure out which hormones do what, and they're realizing that the hormones themselves don't act independently, and that they're synergistic effects that happen from having combination of hormones. So it's a very new science, and the sky's the limit in terms of research. But important to us is understanding how the cells communicate and what are the outcomes of these hormonal effects, particularly their effect on fat tissue and muscle tissue. So we spend a lot of time talking about the nervous system, and we discussed the chemical communication that exists within that, and using neurotransmitters to repeat a signal through the body. This is a locally stored chemical at the terminal button there, and we talked about acetylcholine as one of the neurotransmitters, and this just basically transfers a signal or a communication from nerve to nerve, so like kind of flipping that switch down. We also have messaging systems for other tissues of the body, signals that say initiate muscle growth, that tend to store fat, increase heart rate, and even increase the fondness and closeness of individuals that we relate to love. These are more broad and not as local as is what we saw here with this synaptic gap. But we, have this particular flow from where the brain can communicate all the way down to the toe, and the toe can communicate all the way through the brain. And there was a very direct channel. As we recall with the nerves, there was efferent pathways and afferent pathways, and there was really no way to gap that out unless you had a connection between a neuron to a neuron. Well, when we look at the endocrine system, it is also a chemical messaging system. And so we look at hormones. These are messages. That's all they are. It's signaling from one part of the body to the other. And in this case, instead of being more local, this is more centralized. And so you have what you see highlighted here in red, the different glands or different sources of hormone production. These are the chemical messengers where they're produced. They're stored or produced on demand, and then they're released, and they transfer through the body, and they take their route via the circulatory system. And we talked about the circulatory system as being an agent to bring red blood cells or oxygen to the tissues, but it also is a highway or pathway for other components. And in this particular case, we're looking at hormones as the messenger. So what ends up happening is you have your one part of the tissue that is your part of the endocrine system that stores or creates the hormones. This has some kind of signaling response. It's being monitored by the nervous system. There's some feedback that's coming in, and this hormone's released. It transfers through the circulatory system, and it has a target cell downstream. And this is an oversimplified version, but when we look at this, there's a particular way that tissues are signaled, that they are then stimulate the release of the hormone that gets dumped into the blood, and then there's a particular receiving end of that message down the chain. So on the left here you see the neuron to neuron stimulation. We talked about this great, like with the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, whether you're talking about nerve to nerve, or we talked a lot about from nerve to muscle, like in a motor neuron. You also have nerve to target cell via the circulatory system. So the nerve itself can release different neurotransmitters or compounds through the circulatory system directly to the nerve. That's part of the sympathetic nervous system, looking at norepinephrine. And then you have on the right, the traditional, which we showed before, the endocrine system, where you have an endocrine cell, a cell that either produces or stores hormones. It is signaled, and then it releases its hormone in the blood vessel that travels through the entire circulatory system, and it will eventually hit its target cell. And so this is akin to like a text message, where you have someone's phone number and you're sending a message out, or you have multiple people, like in a text chain, that you're sending tons of messages out to people, but you are able to identify who you want to include on that list and who you don't. So there's a very specific targeting. And when we look at these messages being broadcasted out, let's say you were operating a ham radio and you were broadcasting a radio signal, anyone with a radio that can tune into that frequency would be able to get that message. You wouldn't be able to create a private channel in that aspect. Now in our digital world with different kind of technologies we can, and so the hormonal system is not like this big broadcast. It does broadcast the hormones throughout the entire circulatory system, but it's only received by particular cells that are in question. And the way the body does this is through this receptor aspect. So when you look at the effect of the endocrine system, it's not just the hormone that's present, it's also, is there a willing recipient to receive that message? And so this is the lock and key theory here. And what you see here is, you see this is the cell membrane, and here are those proteins that we talked about before, and you can see that each of these proteins have different shapes and combinations, and think of this as like a lock. And you have certain chemicals or hormones that work either synergistically or antagonistically that can either enhance or decrease the effect of the hormone. And basically what needs to happen is this hormone has to match this receptor in order for that message to be received. So if a receptor does not exist on that cell membrane, that hormone is going to keep on going right by, and that cell is not going to receive that signal, and it's not going to have an effect. So when we look at the optimization of hormones or hormone function, it's not just the hormone presented as well or produced, it's also the receptor. And in some cases, the receptor sensitivity, how sensitized or numb you are to that effect, resistant you are, that plays a bigger role in your outcomes. And so like when we look at the case of diabetes, for instance, diabetes is not an insulin issue. It is an insulin. It's actually too much insulin being produced. And so why people become insulin diabetic or insulin dependent is because their receptors have downregulated. The message is loud and clear, right? There's tons of hormone floating through the blood. The problem is it's falling on deaf ears. The signaling is not there. So you have very specific hormones that interact with very specific receptors. In some cases, this is on the outside of the cellular membrane, and in some cases, this is inside the cellular membrane, just outside the nucleus, depending upon if it's a fat-based or protein-based hormone, which we'll talk about in another slide. But this kind of shows the extracellular space. So in the white here, you see this is outside the cell, and you have the hormone that's released. And only hormones that have the particular receptor shape will this message be transmitted down and have its effect. And then in cells that don't have those particular receptors, it's business as usual. So again, I know this is the third time I'm saying it's not just the receptor, or it's not just the hormone itself, it's also the availability of the receptors. And we call that the sensitivity. And so if the hormone has a great effect because you have lots of receptors, you're considered sensitized to that hormone. You're sensitive to it, so you don't need a lot of it to get an effect. And if you don't have a lot of receptors, you're resistant to it, meaning that you need more of the hormone to get the same effect. And that's where, like diabetes, insulin resistance leads to tissue failure and breakdown, anabolic resistance, cortisol resistance, right? Those first two things are considered quote-unquote bad things, whereas cortisol resistance, as we'll talk about, might be a beneficial thing. So again, here's the endocrine system. You have the nervous system, which is the central modulator of everything that's happening, right? You have your autonomic nervous system, your flight or flight, or your parasympathetic, your rest and recover. And this is the main division between keeping balance, homeostasis. You have the pineal, the pituitary gland here just below the pineal gland, and this is considered the master regulator because a lot of these hormones that produce at the pituitary gland, what they do is they have downstream effects to, say, the thyroid, to the gonads, to the kidneys, particularly to the adrenals. And so there's these multiple chains of hierarchy and commands that exist within that. Like I said, this can get very complex, and we're not going to get into that level of detail. We're just going to appreciate some of the things that are within our control from manipulation of lifestyle factors and exercise, where we can maximize the endocrine environment that lends to the goals that we're trying to work with our clients. And some of the parts of the body that you wouldn't think of the endocrine system, like the pancreas or the liver, even where we'll talk about here is adipose tissue. Your fat tissue is a huge part of the endocrine system. It produces lots of hormones that aren't necessarily favorable to losing body fat. But you can see that it's very global. But in the end, it's all dependent upon the circulatory system. That doesn't matter where it's coming from to get there, and it's dependent upon the receptor sensitivity of if that hormone is going to have an effect or not. So again, when we look at the endocrine system as a whole, just think that these are chemical messengers that are being synthesized, stored, and released into the blood via this endocrine system. And all of these organs that you see here on the screen are part of the endocrine system. You have two main categories we're going to talk about next. You have protein-based, so polypeptide hormones, and you have steroid or fat, aka cholesterol-based hormones. And all of these hormones, regardless if they're protein-based or fat-based, are regulated and excreted from all over the body. As I said, the pituitary gland is the master gland, and these hormones are intimately involved with protein synthesis, degradation mechanisms for breaking down fat tissues like lipolysis, gluconeogenesis. So everything that we talked about last module in terms of are you burning fat, are you burning sugar, are you storing fat, are you storing sugar, are all dependent upon the hormonal environment that is there. And so this is where we get into this like anabolic, which we typically think as a good thing, and it all depends on what tissue we're talking about, or catabolic when we're looking at the breakdown of tissue. So we have these two categories of hormones. We have steroid-based, which are fat or lipid-based, and they're fat-soluble, meaning they interact well. They don't need a special key or a transporter to get through. And then you have your peptide-based, which are your protein-based, which are your amino acid and are water-soluble. So we'll talk about our steroid first. And the backbone of all the steroid hormones is the sterol molecule that you see at the top. And you have your, which makes the foundation or the base of cholesterol. So cholesterol, the same cholesterol that is considered the evil thing for your heart and for, it's been demonized. But if you're not a obligatory vegetarian, vegan, so you're an omnivore or you're not an omnivore, you're an herbivore, and you eat some, your body's going to produce cholesterol. So if you stop eating cholesterol, your body's going to produce cholesterol. If you eat a lot of cholesterol, your body's not going to produce as much. So your body needs cholesterol because it forms the backdrop of all of our cell membranes and all of these really wonderful steroid fat-based hormones that we need. And as you can see here, that steroid molecule there is those those 3 hexagons and 1 pentagon here. That's reflected here in this cholesterol background, backbone, and then just varies a little bit on the distal end of what's connected or attached there. But if you look at cholesterol here, you can see sterol, which is the backbone of cholesterol, which makes the foundation of testosterone. You see that testosterone and estrogen are so similar, and as we'll talk about when we look at male and female differences, that the way that men's estrogen comes from, it's not merely a conversion of testosterone to estrogen. And what a lot of people don't realize is that men have as much estrogen as they have testosterone. So it's not that they have all this testosterone, no estrogen. They have a boatload of testosterone, which also means they have a boatload of estrogen as well. But again, you can see estrogen has that same 4-molecule ring. And then you have cortisol, which again is considered the antithesis to testosterone, and it too also has that sterol backbone. So you can see here that cholesterol is important for the production of our testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, which isn't listed here, and cortisol, which helps with the anti-inflammatory and recovery component. So those are your steroid-based hormones based on steroids, sterol, cholesterol, and those are based on fats and are fat soluble. Now you have your peptide base, which are your amino acids, and peptide is protein, and so you have very small single amino acid, so you have tyrosine here, which makes up the amine hormone group, which is like amino acid, right? Not very creative in their name, so amino acid, amines. And things like adrenaline are the single protein, single amino acid based components. Then you can get a more complex chain like vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, and you can see now the complexity that comes in. These are really complex, and it looks complex, but this is nothing more than a bunch of amino acids that are linked together. And so we can just look at it like this, where you have like your cysteine and tyrosine and phenylene, and so you have all of your amino acids that are there. You can get longer chains like insulin, and you can see the structure that's there, or then its antithesis glucagon, and then you can get very long chains like growth hormone, which have like 190 proteins. And so you have quite a bit of these proteins that exist, these peptide hormones, and all are produced and utilized in the same way in terms of these are water soluble, and they have different responsibilities, if you will, when they have to transport through the body. So when you look at the polypeptides or the water soluble, you can see that they're secreted here from the cell, whatever it may be, pituitary, pancreas, so forth, and they're water soluble, and so the blood is water, and so it can transfer freely through the blood no problem, so it doesn't need a transport mechanism. Now when it gets to the cell, however, this is a protein, a water-based, a water-phobic membrane. So it's a fat, it's the phospholipid, and so it's fat-loving, water-fearing, and protein is water-soluble. It can't penetrate through this membrane. And so it needs a very specific receptor on the outside, so like insulin, growth hormone, glucagon, in order for it to have its effect. If this receptor is not here, this hormone's not able to do its job. It's able to do its job, which is this cell is not going to get the message, right? It's going to be left out of the party. The invitation was not received. But if that receptor is there, there's a cascade that occurs either right inside the cell or on the cell wall or within the nucleus, and it gets the desired effect, whether it's uptake of glucose, breakdown of fat, increase in protein synthesis, whatever it may be, and it's all dependent upon the particular hormone. When you look at the, and this kind of shows the structure here, where this is looking more at the transport through the circulatory system, and you can see the like the relay molecules for whatever has to happen. So the receptor needs to be there, and then this is common to all the peptide-based hormones. And then after that hits the receptor, whether it affects other receptors on the cell wall or has some effect into the nucleus itself, it's all dependent upon the hormone. So then if we look on the other side, we look at lipid soluble. These are fat-based, fat-loving, and water-fearing. And so since the blood is water, you do need some transport mechanism. So you either need some kind of cholesterol, like a lipoprotein that is usually referred to as cholesterol, which is not cholesterol, or you need some other kind of transport protein that binds to the hormone and then it's able to get to its destination. Once it gets to the destination, however, since this is a fat-based membrane, it does not need a receptor to do its job. What it does need, though, is a receptor to get into the nucleus. So the receptors are still needed. It doesn't matter if it's fat-based or water-based. It's just where the receptor is located. With protein-based, water-soluble, the receptors are on the outside of the cell membrane. With the fat-soluble, the receptors are inside somewhere. The effect, though, is still the same, and it's going to end up into the nucleus to get some kind of protein transcription or some other component. This kind of shows here that there's no channel or receptor that's needed on the outside to get into the cell, but once in the cell, there is some kind of steroid receptor that it interacts with, and then that goes into the nucleus to transfer its message. So some kind of translator, if you want to look at it from that perspective. So that's the primary difference from the water-soluble versus the lipid-soluble, is that via the blood, you don't need a transport mechanism for the protein-based, but you do for the fat-based. To get into the cell wall, you need a receptor on the outside for the protein-based, but you don't need that for the fat-based. But the end result, some kind of cytoplasmic response or cellular response or protein transcription or gene regulation, whatever it is, it will have its same effect. When we look at the primary role of the hormonal system, it is to maintain this homeostasis, which is that physiological balance. It's that stimuli versus the response. And the endocrine system is 100% responsible for releasing hormones from the glands into the circulation. And these hormones act on specific aspects of the physiology or anatomy. And so this is like regulating cellular metabolism, facilitating the cardiovascular response to exercise. So the reason why your heart rate increases is not because you started exercising, it's because you started exercising, that put a metabolic demand on the body, and the hormones that are released, that's what caused the increase in heart rate. This transport of nutrients across the membrane, so every time you eat carbohydrate, your body needs insulin to bring that down. Every time your body eats protein, your body releases glucagon to break down the amino acids. So there's this cause and effect that exists all through the body. And when we look at this homeostasis aspect, this is again the stress response, and so you're exposed to some kind of stress, emotional, mental, physical, psychological, whatever it is, that creates a response. You get an inflammatory aspect. You get you get an immune response, cortisol, illness, and what this is showing is the downward spiral of stress, because it can be accumulative if you're not getting the recovery. But we'll talk more about that in the adaptation. But basically, if you look here at the image on the right, you have homeostasis, right, balance. You're exposed to something you're not used to doing, so you're off balance. Your body then secretes B, and it might be like a balancing act back and forth. It might release some of B to get back to A to balance, and it might be too much, and it's just kind of back and forth, back and forth. And the image on the left here kind of shows that cycle, that there's some response by the higher centers from, like, it's monitoring the stress response, homeostasis. It says we're out of balance, and so it's going to stimulate hormone A to bring that into balance. That has its effect on cell type B, and then the way the body's worked out is that once this is in balance, releases a hormone to stop that production. So it has these negative feedback loops, so that we're always operating in that Goldilocks principle, not too hot, not too cold, just right. And so the body is designed this way to be able to get to homeostasis as quickly and as effectively as possible. This kind of shows the negative feedback loops here with temperature. You're too cold, so your body is triggered to shiver. You're shivering. In that shivering process, you're producing muscle contraction. Muscle contraction requires energy. The byproduct of that is heat. You get heat, warm, and now that warmth signals back, and you're no longer triggered to shiver, or vice versa. Your body temperature increases, you start sweating, your body cools off, and you no longer need to sweat, right? So you have these contained feedback loops to respond to particular stimuli. You do have some positive feedback loops that are like kind of reinforcing of one another. So like Childbirth is one where once the signal is triggered, it's going to enhance that trigger and get further and further and more intense, more intense, more intense. Blood clotting is one of them too. Like, there's no mechanism to stop blood clotting. Blood clotting stops once the injury is there, but it's another mechanism that exists. So you do have some of these positive feedback loops, but most of the time it's set up in these negative feedback loops where you have a hormonal response, and then during that response you're releasing another hormone at the same time that's preparing to shut that response off, right? To keep everything in balance. Our sympathetic and parasympathetic responses are perfect at this whole like rest and recovery followed by stress followed by rest and recovery. And so every time you have a sympathetic response, you should have a parasympathetic response to counter effect that sympathetic aspect. And your parasympathetic ramps up until you hit balance, and then it turns off, and then your sympathetic and parasympathetic are both off, hopefully, or they're in just perfect balance until another stressor comes along that requires a parasympathetic aspect. So in this case, your body experiences some kind of threat. The pituitary gland is triggered by the nervousness, the anxiety, that loud noise, or the visual stimulation, or the decreased oxygen, or whatever it is. It releases from the pituitary gland stimulating hormones to the adrenals. The adrenals then release cortisol and the catecholamines, so like ephedrine, norepinephrine, and then you get all of the things associated with your flight or flight response. You get your increased sweating, increased heart rate, tunnel vision, the rapid breathing, and then you would have, following that, after the threat is neutralized or gone, or you're dead, whatever, but hopefully the flight or flight response did its job, your parasympathetic kicks in, and everything you see here is opposite. Right? Your digestion increases, your heart rate drops back down, your pupils constrict back down, and you don't have tunnel vision. Your breathing relaxes, your body no longer is using sugar for fuel and goes back to fat metabolism. And so it's a perfect harmony. Just like you have an agonist-antagonist relationship for muscle movement, you have an agonist-antagonist relationship for your hormonal responses. And we looked at this before when we looked at the autonomic nervous system, with the sympathetic and parasympathetic aspect, right? You have this agonist and then antagonist, and then you have the opposite to keep it back to balance. And the body's doing everything it can to keep this on the horizon, to keep everything balanced and ready to go. So that's the overarching view of the endocrine system. We're going to look at next, we'll look at the specific hormonal outcomes that occur from the types of anabolic versus catabolic, and we'll have a discussion on what we want to have anabolic and what we want to have catabolic.